probably seen this picture. So this is the picture about the Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on the 8th of December 1941. And perhaps many of you have heard more often of the Pacific War. But I rather prefer to use this word, this phrase, the Asia-Pacific War, because it is rather difficult for me to distinguish between the war involving Japan in Asia and the war, Japanese war against the United States. You can find the continuation between those two wars. And I should think that it is impossible to treat those two wars separately. And many the historians who emphasize the significance of Japan's aggression into the Asian continent tends to use this the phrase, the Asia-Pacific War. So in order to talk about the Japan's role to the Asia-Pacific War, we have to start with the period immediately after the First World War. And then, as I told you in the previous series of lectures, Japan was rather forced to be faced with the quite significant and the drastic change of international political games caused by the termination of the First World War. So, as a result of the end of the First World War, and as a result of the some inducement of a new nature of international order, the Japanese leaders were faced with the necessities to adjust Japan itself to the new situations. But the people's thinking and the thought couldn't be so easily changed. There's some Japanese leaders were very sensitive about the necessity to adjust Japan to the new situations. But I should think that you can find the same kind of the situations in your the usual life. I mean, some people really wants to be very. Some people are quite sensitive to the change or the transformation, but at the same time, some other people are not at all sensitive to the change. Rather, they prefer to be just maintain their old ideologies or ideas and just a perception. And the same kind of situations could be found in this period of Japan, and especially immediately after the end of the First World War, and immediately before the starting of the Japan's intrusion and Japan's aggression into China. So there was the troublesome development of the domestic struggles between the groups which are quite which showed the strong preference to the adjustment to the new situation, and the other who were the very conservative and the traditionalistic sort of the group. So I'd like to talk about briefly the period of the troubled domestic adjustment between 1919 and 1927. well, before getting into the main talk, I'd like you to remember the situations during the last period of the Tokugawa shogunate. You see, that because of the great powers' threats on the Tokugawa shogunate, and the many Japanese leaders, especially in Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosa, were faced with the necessities to set up some new thinking in order to adjust Japan to the new situations caused by the military threats from the Western powers, including the United States. And then, over that problem, that they developed some domestic struggles over the problems of how to adjust Japan to the situations. And there were quite intensive domestic struggles among those factions or the clans and the Tokugawa shogunate as well. And the same kind of situations could be found here. They're being faced with some international change surrounding Japan. It seems inevitable for the Japanese domestic situations to be dragged into some political struggles over the problem of adjustment. And during the period between 1919 and 1927, well, that there were, largely speaking, that there were two confronting the factions. One of them could be called internationalists, and the other traditionalists. Internationalists, nationalists. Okay, the internationalists were quite sensitive to the change surrounding Japan, and the traditionalists were rather against the thoughts and the perceptions with the insisting the necessary adjustments of Japan to the changing. Internationalists, well, they commonly shared the following the thinking and the perception. Internationalists emphasize the significance of the international cooperation, especially cooperation with the United States and Great Britain, Anglo-Saxon powers. And because they emphasized the significance of international cooperation, but they were very much apt to accept the emergence of new diplomacy. But in contrast to the internationalists, the traditionalists still clung to the very old views of international politics. That was, power politics was the most significant and the basic nature of international politics. So that they were supporting the continuation of old diplomacy. In other words, that they they thought that they put the very much weight upon the significance of military power, and at the same time, they regarded the balance of the power politics as the most significant method of diplomacy. Internationalists, as I told, they tried to set up, when they established good relations with the United States and the Great Britain. But the traditionalists adopted the more hardliner policy towards the United States and the Great Britain. Internationalists also they turned their eyes to the economic aspects of international politics. But they thought that by promoting the economic interactions and the transactions with especially the American and the British partners, that they could make the international relations surrounding Japan, especially over China, that could be more stabilized. But when you look at the traditionalist perception, they thought that the economic interdependence could be very much damages to Japan, especially during the time of military conflicts. You see, the traditionalists, as I thought, they put the more emphasis upon the significance of military politics. That is, the quite old-fashioned the power political perception. They tended to think about the worst case, which is, of course, the case of wars or the military conflicts. And in the situations of military conflicts, the economic interdependence of the other countries could work a kind of as the shackle, because if Japan had the very deepened economic interdependence with, for example, the United States and the Great Britain, the Japan could not really move freely. So because, whereas I told you later, that Japan was so much dependent upon the US economy. And so, the traditionalists rather preferred to adopting autarky-oriented policy or anti-interdependence policy. They tried to make Japan a more self-sufficient country. But as you know, Japan was and is a very small, tiny island country without so much of natural resources. So you can just very easily raise the question, how Japan could be an autarkic sort of country. So the natural and logical conclusion from the traditionalist viewpoint, Japan needed to expand its territory to China in order to get enough natural resources in order to be autarkic or self-sufficient. So that's why the traditionalists put more emphasis on the relevancy of the military expansion to China. But the internationalists tend to think that they could make some expansion of influence to China through non-military method. That was the enhancing or the promotion of the economic interdependence. So they thought that Japan could make good relations with the Anglo-American powers through economic interdependence, and the Japan could also expand its influence to China by economic power. And then in that corollary, the traditionalists supported the policy, the Japan's foreign policy, to promote the economic interdependence. And then, on the basis of economic interdependence, that they thought that Japan could be a very good partner to the other countries for international cooperation. So you could see the very clear distinction between those two the groups. So internationalists thought that they could just adjust Japan to the drastic changing of international order outside of Japan. But the traditionalists, that they just tried to continue what they thought, what they regarded as the past successful the foreign relations of Japan. In other words, the traditionalists were still living in the world of the naked power politics, the quite old game of international politics, which had been set up around the end of the Shogunate period. And of course, the traditionalists it was rather the natural, in a way, that the traditionalists clung to that kind of old perception about the international political game, because from the first Sino-Japanese War till the Russo-Japanese War, the many of the Japanese just experienced the kind of the repeated justification of their the ways of international relations. You see, Japan tried to build up its military forces, and then they successfully did that, and because of that, Japan could just join in the cycle of big powers, of great powers. That was from their viewpoint, that was actually the historical record of the justification or the legitimacy of Japan's history after the Meiji Restoration. So they didn't really want to recognize the changing and the transformation of international, or the game, or the structure and the nature of international political game. But internationalists were rather more flexible. They were flexible. And most of the internationalists had the good experiences of for example, the living outside of Japan in the United States or Great Britain. So that's why that they were more sensitive to the outside world. One of the most typical members of internationalists was Kijuro Shidehara, who was the foreign minister between 1924 and 27. And one of the most the typical traditionalists was the Gichi Tanaka. He was a prime minister between 1927 and 29. You could say many Tanakas in Japan's history. But the problem was that most of them were bad people.
Most of them are bad people.
Thank God I have no, I am not the cycle of the relatives. And Shidehara Kijiro was trying very hard to establish a very good relationship with the United States and the Great Britain. And then he was one of the, how could I say, he had a very good and excellent command of English. Because he studied English very much in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he had, of course, an experience of being abroad. But Tanaka, Hiiji Tanaka, he had no such an experience. He was just the army man, and then. Well, the problem of the Japanese army is that many of the army generals or army the top officers did not really have a good experience abroad. The Navy was a bit different, but at any rate, that these two people were regarded as the typical members, typical member of the both by each faction. And from 1919 to 1927. In Japan, one could say this series of intensive efforts for adjustment. In other words, the internationalists had upper hand in the domestic struggle. Well, in fact, after the end of the First World War, from 1919, there was the situations which indicated the relative stability of international affairs. Well, for example, though the international economic activities were very much disturbed during the First World War, of course, the international the economic transaction and the trade were very much increasing after the First World War. So that's why the deepening international economic interdependence, but this factor increased its presence in the development of international affairs. So many countries experienced the increase of the amount of international trade, international economic transactions. And one of the most how can I say, the clear examples of that was a stable world economy, which were demonstrated by the Anglo-American return to the gold standard. So you could see in this development the situation where the internationalists would have more say on the Japanese foreign policy, because the situation that developing at that time was very much suitable to the internationalist foreign policies. And in the situation, in these situations, there emerged the typical internationalist diplomacy of the Japanese government emerged. Well, that was called the Shidehara diplomacy. Shidehara, as I told, became the foreign minister in 1924. Well, he was the foreign minister between 24 and 27. So he made much efforts to adjust to Japan to growing economic interdependence. And he tried to establish the better relations with the United States and Great Britain. As you see, I'd like you to remember the Washington system. You see, the United States tried to inject the principle of new diplomacy into the Pacific situations. And the Americans and the British, when they held the sort of perception of being threatened by the rapid growth of Japanese naval power. So the relationship between Japan and the Anglo-American power that showed a sort of a cacophony or the sound of frictions. But Shidehara tried to overcome that situations, and he rather tried to keep their good relations, or they established better relations with them. And at the same time, by establishing that kind of better relation with the United States and Great Britain, he tried to promote Japan's influence over China through the cooperation with Anglo-American powers. So this was the basic nature of the Shidehara diplomacy. But what the Shidehara was the faced with some serious obstacles to promote this diplomacy, internationalist diplomacy. There were mainly two obstacles. The first thing that one should point out, the inherited economic weakness of Japan. During the First World War, as I told, the Japan experienced quite a good economic growth. So because the great powers were forced to concentrate on the battles against the Germany and Italy, and Japan was not really dragged into the main battlefield of the First World War. So Japan could enjoy the rapid growth of the economy. But even so, compared to the major powers, Western powers, Japan was still weak in economic terms. And that's why, unfortunately for the internationalists, Japan did not really have the economic assets enough to use that economic power for expanding their influence over China. And the other damage was caused by the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. That was a year before the Shigehara diplomacy. But the damage caused by the Great Kanto earthquake could not be really overcome very easily. So again, the economic damage caused by the Kanto earthquake that made it very difficult for internationalists to promote their internationalist foreign policy. So, that while the internationalists encountered those serious obstacles, the traditionalists started to bear resistance against the major stream of the domestic politics. Tanaka Kiichi became the prime minister in 1927. And as a told, he thought that economic independence was just a shackle on the freedom of action of Japan. So he just ignored the significance of the setting up good relations, good economic relations with the United States and Great Britain. And he regarded military power as the most significant and effective tools for power politics. And well, I didn't actually put it there, but put it here, but the Tanaka Kiichi also thought that Japan needs to expand its territory, well, the political influence over China, even with the military threat. And one of the most significant and serious international problems at the time was the instability in China. So there were certainly many warlords struggling against each other. And the central government of China showed the ineffectiveness of governing its own country. So the Tanaka administration tries to take advantage of that situation in China. So the administration made an expedition to Shantung between 1927 and the 28th. Sorry about my the pronunciation of the Chinese the name and the place name or the name of people person. I had no confidence in, for example, pronouncing Changzuo. Zhang Zuolin. Sorry about that. Right. The Tanaka
这套拼音系统不适合你老师。
我也觉得，
你还是用标准的。
他搞成这样，我都不知道是什么。
Well, he just tried to make some sort of expansion of influence into China by making some conspiracies. The one of them was the assassination of Chan Tso-min. He was one of these warlords. Well, first of all, the Japanese government, the Giji's government, was trying to make a good connection with the General Chan. Because they thought that they could use him as a pawn. But Chan started to be assertive, and then the Tanaka administration just found that it was quite difficult to just control him. So they tried assassination and assassination of him, and the place succeeded.
什么呀 ？It is quite too complicated. Quite hard.
But when the report about the instance of the assassination of Chan, that report, when that report reached the emperor, Showa emperor, got furious about that. So the emperor decided to dismiss Tanaka. And then after that, the Osaji Hamaguchi, they took the office of premiership. And the Hamaguchi was an internationalist. So he tried to roll back the traditionalists' the tendency. He again decided to adopt the Shidahara diplomacy. And his administration recognized the nationalist of China in 1930. And at the same time, the Hamaguchi administration tried to restore the good relationship with the United States and Great Britain. So the London Naval Disarmament Conference, held in 1930, was the very good opportunity for the new Japanese government to show their goodwill to the international cooperation. So the London Naval Disarmament Conference, in fact, tried again to restrain the Japan's expansion and build-up of the naval forces. But the Hamaguchi administration decided to accept the provision made by the London Naval Disarmament Conference. But of course, this sort of deed by Hamaguchi administration caused a series of struggles with the militarists and the traditionalists. They didn't die yet. And the Hamaguchi had a very interesting nickname, Lion. But if you look at his face, well, quite similar to the animal. But at the same time, Hamaguchi was the, how would I say, he was, I don't know how to say this in English, well, he had the guts. He had guts. and then he could keep the very the rather adamant the sort of the attitude towards the militarists and traditionalists. But unfortunately, he was assassinated. You know, this period of Japan was quite the strange the period from my viewpoint. There were so many terrorist activities to assassinate the several important internationalist people. And from the viewpoint of the Hamaguchi administration and internationalists, again, the economic damage took place when the Great Depression started in October 1929. There was serious damage to the internationalists. You see, the Great Depression, as you know, started in the Wall Street in the United States. And not very many people expected that the depression in the United States, in New York, but they didn't expect that to spread worldwide, all over the world. But the fact was quite different from their expectation. The damage caused by the economic damage caused by the Great Depression in the Wall Street very fast the spread to all over the world. And many of the people, many of the observers just considered that the economic interdependence made such a fast and worldwide spread of the economic damage caused by the Great Depression. You see, but this was actually the great damage to the internationalists. Internationalists insisted that the economic interdependence was the most salient sort of the indication of the transformation of the world. They actually thought that, though there was not really perfect transformation, but there was a great significant transformation of international politics, from the power politics to the economic interdependence. But the Great Depression demonstrated that the economic interdependence was not that beneficial, rather harmful. So the traditionalist policy, or the traditionalist the ideology in a way, well, they're insisting the significance of autarky seems to be justified. So that situation caused by the Great Depression, of course, Japanese economy was greatly damaged by the Great Depression. And because of that, and then because of the situation, the traditionalists and the group started to become more influential. And the Japan's economic hardship caused by the Great Depression was regarded as the economic hardship caused by the economic interdependence. And this situation inevitably encouraged the ultra-nationalists, which were basically traditionalists, to attack the internationalists' cause. But turning your eyes on the much broader international situation, there was another obstacle to the internationalists, or a damaging sort of obstacle. Well, in order to cope with the economic instability caused by the Great Depression, many of the Western powers started to set up and establish a closed economic zone in which they could protect their own domestic industries and the economic businesses. And most of them were Western powers with some colonies, say colonial powers. So they tried to set up and establish the closed economic zone by enclosing those colonies and tried to exclude some economic influence or some economic transactions from outside of their zones. At that time, of course, there were some efforts to make some international coordinations to recover the stability of international economy. But those efforts, most of those efforts, they failed. So the world went into the period of block economy. So, faced with that, the development, the Japanese leaders were rather forced to think of the establishing its own economic bloc. They thought that it was needed for the survival of Japan. And of course, as you could be aware, the power and the influence of the internationalists were getting down, and were in fact their idea of enhancing economic independence for stability of international politics could not be materialized, and the trend of setting up a bloc economy. So many of the Japanese economic leaders and the traditionalists started to argue and insist that Japan needs to set up its own bloc economy. But immediately they arrived at the conclusion. They reached the conclusion that Japan was, and the Japanese economy was strong enough to build up its own bloc economy through economic method. But at the same time, they agreed to set up Japan's own bloc economy. So what sort of instruments should be used for setting up such a bloc economy? But from the traditionalist viewpoint, it was logical, from their own viewpoint, to go to China, with the most effective tools in hand. That was military forces. sure many of you are aware of this. You see, Japan, since the Meiji Restoration, the modernization of Japan was in a way, militarization of Japan, without the sufficiently enhancing and promoting the Japanese economic strength. It's a top-heavy state. I hope you could remember the city chart I made. And that's the quite typical sort of, and the peculiar sort of the nature of Japan as a state. You know, that affects the Japanese situation at this period. At this period, Japan did not really have the economic power enough to build up its own bloc economy because of its economic weakness caused by the process of the Japan's militarization, or in other words, Japan's modernization. Under these situations in which the internationalists were just pushed to the corner, there were the terrorist activities by the ultra-nationalists on the internationalists. Where Hamaguchi was assassinated, and one of the financial ministers during that time, Junosuke Inoue, was also assassinated in 1932. And Takuma Dan, who was the president of the Mitsui Corporation, was also assassinated in 1932. So, this situation demonstrates this sort of aspect. You see, the terrorists those fanatic people understood that they could not really change the situation dominated by the internationalists through some legal or political procedure. So that's why they tried to kill those the significant and the important people. Well, I should think that those terrorists are idiots, I would say. That the ordinary people could not really resist against the fear caused by those terrorist activities. And many of the politicians who had the tendency towards the internationalists could not be exceptional. So the series of terrorist activities during that period affected very much the Japanese societies and the Japanese politics. So now, under the fear of those kinds of terrorist activities, and because of the damaging situations caused by the Great Depression and the establishment of a bloc economy, the influence of the internationalists decreased very much. And then the traditionalists, started to make some revenge by military expansion to China. That caused the so-called Manchurian crisis in 1931. September 1931, the Kwantung Army, in Japanese, Kantogun, without the consent from the Japanese government, was started to move very in depth of Manchuria, and finally that they occupied the region of the area of Manchuria. You see, this is also the quite typical the pattern of Japan's military. I don't think I have already talked about this, but just tracing back to the Japan's expedition to Siberia in 1908 with the United States. You see, that expedition, military expedition, was not successful. They couldn't really stop the Russian Revolution. And, well, faced with the success of the Russian Revolution, the American military very quickly retreated from Siberia. And within Japan, in Tokyo, the government was the Hara government, who was in a way, internationalist, and he was the pro-cooperation with the United States. Decided to retreat Japanese military forces from Siberia as well. But the militaries, the Japanese militaries, did not really listen to the Hara's the order to retreat from Siberia. And some of the really traditionalists, sort of members of Hara's government, had the secret connection with the Japanese military and the hard line of the members of the foreign ministry. So the Japanese armies did not really retreat, and that they stayed there much longer. So the military forces, especially the army, were demonstrated the pattern of not listening to the order from Tokyo. The same kind of thing used to happen here in 1931. So there was the example of the failure in Siberian expedition. The Japanese, well, the naval or the army, the leaders, political leaders, and even historians did not try to study the failure of the Siberian expedition. They didn't try to learn history. Especially they hated to learn some history of a mistake or failure. Well, because of the longer stay of the Japanese armies in Siberia, in the case of the Siberian expedition, the diplomatic status of Japan was really degraded, and Japan became isolated. And at the same time, the relations between Japan and the United States were devastated. And the same kind of things were going on at the time of Manchurian crisis. The Canton Army just how can I say, they made just autonomous movements without the order or without the acceptance of Tokyo. And the problem was that their movements, their military movements, were successful. Well, because of the instability in China. And at the same time, it is actually really surprising, that this kind of things could happen in the modern period. The Kazan army just decided to establish a state as its puppet. That was Manchukuo. If this kind of thing happened, usually the central government tried to punish those people who took the initiative of this kind of movement, and the Quantum Army. But because of the pressure of the traditionalist tendency in Japan, and at the same time the pressure posed by the terrorist activities, the Japanese politicians did not really even try to punish those military people, those militaries who made these situations in Manchuria. The leader of the Quantum Army was Lieutenant General Kanji Ishiwara. Well, he was in a way a brilliant man. He had a great ability, it was a military ability, and he had, the charisma, as they say, but he had rather the fanatic idea of about Japan and emperor, very fanatic. He thought that Japan could control the world by the moral power of the emperor of Japan. This kind of thing. This is kind of. And the establishment of the Manchukuo did not really encounter any strong the resistance. And then the Manchukuo became the front base for further expansion of the Japanese, especially army, into the deep side of China. And the Manchurian crisis indicated that the ultra-nationalist militaries' unilateral action for overwhelming the domestic political struggles and economic confusions were done. See, so within Japan, some of the Japanese people really praised that unilateral aggression by the Quantum Army, because it would solve the domestic political struggles and economic confusions caused by the Great Depression and the establishment of the bloc economies. And because of the occupation and the domination of the Manchuria and the establishment of Manchukuo, Japan is now able to establish its own economic zone, yen bloc. It was done through military forces. And of course you could see that whether this kind of instance could be regarded by the Americans as an invalid activity of Japan with the purposes for domination and monopoly of Chinese market. So the establishment of the Manchukuo really irritated the Americans very much. So again, you say like the expedition to Siberia. Well, this kind of unilateral action by the Japanese military caused the serious devastation in Japan's relation with the United States. But not only with the United States, but also with the major countries of the international society. Japan experienced the devastation of its foreign relations. Faced with the Manchurian crisis, the League of Nations decides to send an investigation team headed by a British army military to Manchuria. But in order to clarify whether Manchukuo was the real, the legitimate nation state or just a puppet state. The Little Commission finally judged that Manchukuo was Japan's puppet state, and that the Manchukuo, where the establishment of the Manchukuo was invalid in terms of international law. You could see a collision between new game of international politics and the old game of international politics here. You see, the Little Commission was sent by the League of Nations. So the Little Commission tried to judge the situation caused by Japan in accordance with the covenant of League of Nations, the new rules of international politics. And of course, the incidents made by the incidents in Manchuria caused by the Japanese military was in accordance with the old rule of international political game or the form of diplomacy. So this is a clear clash between those two formats of diplomacy. And the Japanese government tries to resist against the decisions made by the League of Nations on the basis of the Little Commission report. But finally, the Japanese government found out that it was in vain. Then in 1933, the Japanese government decided to get out of the League of Nations. League of Nations. So you could say, well, a very good, very important question. The League of Nations, was the League of Nations effective to deter there's some sort of activities by some nation, or by some member state, to challenge the international rule that's set by the League of Nations. Set by the League of Nations. What the League of Nations could do was just to insist that Japan's movement in Manchuria was invalid in terms of international law. International law means the covenant of League of Nations. But the League of Nations could not do anything except just issuing the declaration that the Japan's conduct was invalid, because there was no enforcing power and the League of Nations. There was no the enforcers. So if you look at the United Nations, the case of the United Nations, you can find out the clear differences. Right? Well, in the case of the United States, the Security Council could set up the military forces of the United Nations. Well, if all the members of the Security Council say yes, especially the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, they could say yes to that kind of the military action by the United Nations. United Nations could send the UN forces, like the case of the Korean War in 1950. But the League of Nations did not really have that kind of enforcing power. They didn't have any authority to organize such an international military forces. So, Japan finally decided to get out of the League of Nations. That means that Japan did not really have to follow any the international legitimacy provided by the League of Nations. So, in a way, Japan got a free hand now. And I'd like to just skip any detail of the developments after 1933. 4 years later, Japan really expanded their military activities in China, and then it led to the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Because of the Manchurian crisis, and because of the decisions made by the League of Nations, Japan got really isolated. And the isolated country, usually try to find out the new friend, even they were bad or good. And Japan and Japanese leaders, now dominated by the influence of the traditionalists and ultra-nationalists, try to find out a new friends. And the conditions for the new friends should be that those new friends have to be isolated in the same way in the world. And they found out a very good, in a way, very bad new friend, Nazi Germany. When I am studying this sort of the process of the Showa Japan, I sometimes really got furious about the ignorance and ignorance of those idiots in Japanese military. Nazi Germany. So at any rate, they found out a new friend, and they concluded anti-Comintern pact with Nazi Germany in November 1936. Anti-Comintern pact was the anti-communist pact. You see, so Nazi Germany and Japan would fight against any aggression made by the communists and the socialists. This was the basic purpose of the anti-Comintern pact. And much worse, 4 years later, the Japanese decided to set up a tripartite alliance with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Fascist Italy. Perhaps they didn't really study the history of the First World War. Italy,
意大利就是个墙头草。
the most unreliable partner. The old generation of the Japanese, well, for example, my father, around over 85 years old, they still make a joke. But next time, we shall do that without Italy. Very bad joke. So the Japanese leaders happily found out two bad partners, and that they established the tripartite alliance. In 1940, you see, well, in 1940, well, in fact, it seemed that the Nazi Germany could make really successful the expansion in Europe. You know, the half of France was occupied by Nazi Germany, and the southern half of the France, well, they declared that they would establish the pro-Nazi government. And the United States did not yet join the Second World War. Only the British tried to fight against Nazi Germany. There was a battle of Britain. You see, it was quite natural in a way for some Japanese nationalists, ultra-nationalists, to misjudge that the world is now, the world history is now on German side. well, there was the rather silly slogan at the time in Japan, "Don't miss the bus." The bus was in Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany, the fascist Italy, and the military Japan, they shared, well, they tried to show that they shared the common stance of anti-communism. But the Americans, the British, did not really trust that. You see, so the setting up of the tripartite alliance, well, triple alliance, really irritates the Americans and the other Western, the democratic countries. And in 1941, as you know, the Soviet Union was attacked by Hitler suddenly. But before that, the Soviet Union and Germany had their non-aggression treaty. But in June 1941, Hitler suddenly broke that treaty. He started to do the aggression toward the Soviet territory. And then that was the starting point of the decline of the power of the Nazi Germany. You see, so if the Japanese leaders had waited for a year, well, they could have thought that that was fortunate. It was fortunate for us to miss the bus. But at any rate, the United States, the faced with the developments, they started to pressurize Japan to restore the situations in China up to the pre-1932 conditions. Well, that was, in other words, the Japan should retreat from China, retreat from Manchuria, and stop supporting the Manchukuo, or stop manipulating the Manchukuo. But the Japanese government ignored this sort of pressure. And then finally, in 1940, in the same year as Japan, they concluded the Triple Alliance, the United States started the embargo of oil, petroleum, and the steel scraps to Japan. So this is clearly the very typical sort of economic sanctions. Now, perhaps you cannot really imagine the situations where Japan was thrown into in 1940, especially under the situations caused by the U.S. embargo of oil and the steel scraps. Steel scraps. What the hell are they? Perhaps you would think. But Japan was so much dependent on the oil from the United States and the steel scraps which was needed to make steel on the United States. So the American embargo really stopped the development or the operation of Japanese industry. And according to the memories of the very old people, like my father, well, after the American embargo, the life standard of Japan was really obviously getting down and down and down, day by day, when he said. So this American pressure was so much effective as to the many of the Japanese people and the Japanese nationalists to, be antagonized against the United States. So this was the really fast, the fastest stage of the process of the clash between the United States and Japan. So now, time's up. So, that's all I have to say.
是不是没课了？
对，我没课，但是我要下去了。然后我要把我钱给我先排送过去。我每天在跟人进行 PY 交流。